Hey, baby, sweetheart, Bambi. Hi. Okay, I really tried. I promised I wouldn't lose my shit. And unfortunately, tatas will fly. Hakunas will not be had. And I will definitely lose my shit in the recording of this episode, but I'm trying my best to still be clear and not be personal with the subject, because it literally is a subject of this particular episode, but what this person has done is so out of fucking pocket, especially when you look at what's going on in the world and the fact that people are still trying to do this shit, that even me being able to speak this calmly is in and of itself a great tempering of the rage, frustration, and just befuddlement that I feel. But let me stop whetting your appetite. Let me just get into it, because I have written a script, and I know if I deviate, it will literally just be me ranting and raving for 2 hours about the horrors of colonialism. So we're not going to do that, although this entire podcast series is basically a living tribute or testimony to just how fucked up colonialism is for many different people across time and space. But today we're going to actually talk about somebody that cares about defending colonialism, because those people, as we have definitely seen in the last month or so, definitely fucking exist and refuse to believe that what they're doing is defending colonialism, motherfuckers. So, let me just... I'm breathing. I'm good. Let me hoosa. So, I have been putting reading off the paper that I want to look at today for 5 years because every single fucking time I read the title, I want to punch somebody in the face and then kick them in the dick. But because I've got nothing better to do, and I really just don't have the time to do an in-depth dive into a historical topic or phenomena, this anger and rage is what I've decided to subject myself to. It's kind of just oh, and I understand that my disdain, disrespect, and overall just distrust in this author is a very passionate response that some might argue plays jump rope with the legal line between incitement or criminal intent and just normal inactionable threats. Because as you guys know, I talk a big game, but if I were a dog, I'd be a fucking chihuahua. I'm literally all bark, no bite. That barking is hella annoying though, and it'll get you to do something, but I will not bite you because bitch, I don't want to taste what you, you're nasty. Anyway, but after I read the title of this paper, if you haven't already checked the title of this episode, you will understand why this frustration and just quiet, aggressive calm is my gut reaction. Because today I will be reviewing the 2018-2017 paper called The Case for Colonialism by a man called Bruce Gilley or Giley. I'm not too invested in making sure I've pronounced his name correctly, although I should, because it reflects more about me and my values than it is about him and his just fucked up beliefs. But in this paper, I think I'm gonna stick with Gilley. Yeah, I'm going to start with Gilley. Gilley argues that colonialism was actually not wholly an evil entity. He says in his introduction that, and I quote, "The notion that colonialism is always and everywhere a bad thing needs to be rethought in light of the grave human toll of a century of anti-colonial regimes and policies." End quote. That is astute. And that while colonialism is synonymous with grotesque human suffering, there are some benefits that it shared with colonized people. And as a result, Western colonialism must return in order to further entrench good governance within the international order. Now, before I continue, allow me to just note what's going on in Israel and Palestine, and note that it is a conflict between a colonizer and the people that it is attempting to colonize and subsequently genocide out of existence so that he can take their land. And I want you to reflect on that conflict and just think about what this man is trying to argue. That, and I quote once more, that the notion of colonialism is always and everywhere a bad thing, and that this needs to be rethought in light of the grave human toll of a century of anti-colonial regimes and policies. End quote. What exactly are we rethinking? Are we saying that it is far worse for these countries to be independent than it is for them to be colonized by somebody who does not give a fuck about the people who actually live there? Is that what he's trying to argue? Well, I don't know. We're going to get into it because no spoilers. Anyway, I'm gonna have to, there's no way I can't be petty throughout this episode, but just like, please let me be petty because that's the only way I'm gonna get through this. And remember, I'm not doing this as a scholar or an academic, even though I am training to become one. I'm literally just doing this as a podcaster and a person that just needs to work through her frustrations and rage in a way that is productive and somewhat cathartic. And this for me is a little bit of catharsis, is I guess equal parts catharsis and also just like enraging, but we'll figure it out. The reason why like I don't think I'll be able to get through this episode without like being petty or anything is because Gilly's arguments presupposes three things. That first, Western colonies were the epitome of good governance at the height of colonization, which they were not. That second, this governance was better, at least compared to the post-colonial states that were established after direct rule was removed, which they weren't. And third, that the end of the colonial era marked the end of direct European involvement in the rule and governance of African nations, when in fact, neocolonialism was a thing and is a thing that African elites both condemned and used to their advantage in their time. But before I dissect this paper, 5 years too late, lol, allow me to just give you a bit of background about our main man, Bruce, here. So the reason why I also don't necessarily respect Gilly here is as we get into it, we'll realize that he misappropriates and misuses historical facts for his own ends, which is just really ironic considering that his entire argument against anti-colonial critique is based on what he claims to be the misappropriation and misuse of historical fact. And number two, he also seems to like come from this perspective that there are people out there that think that colonialism is still like this bad thing, when, as I said in last episode, about 30% of British people believe that that their past colonies are worse off after having gotten independence, and there are many people in England who still believe that colonialism is a good thing. For example, when Charles, our mandem, the king, went to Kenya, I think it was towards the end of October, so like last week, and he apologized. Like, it was the most bullshit one sentence apology for British colonial rule. It was nothing. And yet people were responding as if King Charles III had given away the crown jewels. And by people, I mean like right-wing pundits who the government seems to court for some fucking reason, if Suella Braverman's presence and mere existence is to be believed. But like, all this is to say that Gilly is out here trying to say that colonialism has a bad rep when there are people who actually either do not believe that bad rep or believe it and are championing colonialism because of that bad rep, because they just don't care about who suffers under colonialism as long as they are the ones who are thriving within that system. And it's just a bit funny that you have a man that's like, oh, boo-hoo, colonialism has such a bad rep. Like, what are we to do? It needs to be rebranded. And it's like, please. Colonialism, people are still out here doing a colonialism. Like, I'm just speechless. And yet, even in my silence, not that I've ever been silent, and yet even in my silence, I am keenly aware that my biggest argument with this man who claims to be a scholar, who so desperately wants to be legitimized and coddled and loved for saying something that has real dangerous consequences, is that he said the quiet bit out loud. Not only that, but for me, it's the fact that like he tries to repackage the age-old justification for colonialism, which is that because the ends, which is good governance, peace, security, democracy, etc., justifies the means, which is colonialism and settler colonialism in particular, then the suffering that those means inflict do not matter. That the civilizing mission is worth more than the death and destruction that colonialism leaves in its wake. The barren futures, the dispossessed people, and the stolen possibility are all worth it for democracy, good governance, peace, and security. Right? And that to me is fucked up, because implicit in his argument is a fact that the positive ideas and practices that colonialism imported could have only been transferred through colonial rule and imposition. He unironically and uncritically argues that Western democracies' ways of knowing and doing and cosmologies are ultimately beneficial and therefore superior, without giving due consideration to what might have been, to what things might have been had they been different, had this knowledge exchange happened under different terms. He also ignores the fact that the colonizers really never intended to give up their possessions, and so left in such a way as to make them dependent on them and therefore failures in their eyes. In short, he makes an argument so ignorant you have to argue and wonder, dude, what the fuck? But at least he's intellectually consistent, because in 2022, not only did he release a paper defending himself and doubling down against his critics, he also released a book defending German colonialism when they, in fact, did a genocide in Namibia. So, yeah. To understand his conclusions, I still maintain that we kind of need to learn a little bit about Gilly so we can at least approach him as an author and as a scholar somewhat empathetically, and that you also understand where he's coming from. So Gilly was born on July 21st, 1966 to parents, one would presume, and in 1988, he got his bachelor's in economics and international relations from the University of Toronto, and in 1991, a master's of philosophy from Oxford. Thereafter, he spent a year teaching English in China and another 7 years working as a journalist in Hong Kong. His time in Hong Kong would coincide with the British handing over the island to China in 1997, and this particular historical event would have a profound impact on his assessment of colonialism. Quoting from an interview he did with a Dutch magazine called EW in 2018, and I quote, "China was the opposite world. If you want to know what Hong Kong would have looked like without the British, you only need to take a look across the border. The tremendous fear among the population of Hong Kong prior to the transfer of power to China in 1997 made a big impression. Many fled. What do you mean, British oppression?" And that's oppression in quotes, end quote. And I get it, right? If you are swimming in an ocean of fear and anxieties and uncertainties, I get why you would long for the way things were. I understand why you'd long for a past misremembered. I think How I Met Your Mother does it best when they tell you about
with high school. It's 4 years of bullies, making fun of all the kids with braces, even after the braces come off and they can walk just fine. But then on graduation day, you suddenly get all misty because you realize you're never going to see those jerks again.
And that, I don't know why your brain does that, but like I think he's going through that in Hong Kong with the people that live there and are from there. But I also do want to contextualize Gillay's experiences, because as stated by Yvonne Lau in Fortune, and I quote, "Hong Kong experienced growing prosperity and democratic reforms later in the 1980s and 1990s, but the decades before were more turbulent. The city experienced widespread riots in 1967, where protesters were against British rule and pro-China. Britain's laissez-faire economic policies helped colonial elites become wealthy, but also created a highly unequal society. Colonial police were criticized for using excessive force and repressing protests during 1967 and the 1980s. Britain, during its rule over Hong Kong, also never granted citizens universal suffrage." Right? And that in and of itself is a form of oppression that like Gilly never fully recognizes or reckons with in his reflexivity that barely shows through in his work. But it's very clear that watching the anxieties of the people take root as China's about to take over Hong Kong had a big impact on his life, because he would later then go on to kind of like become this like right-wing guy who defends colonialism and defends all the good that it brings. I think, and I don't want to, become a therapist, but like I think because of what he experienced in Hong Kong. So upon returning to the West after 1997, Gilly pursued his PhD in politics from Princeton between 2004 and 2007. And in 2008, he started teaching at Portland State University, where he entered the tenure track in 2011, which basically means he can't be fired for shit, and became a full professor in 2016. 2016. And like, I love how like having that job security allowed this man to completely go out of pocket and just like go fucking wild. Because in 2016 he published a paper titled, and I quote, Chinua Achebe on the positive legacies of colonialism, where he suggested that Achebe had, not only towards the end of his life, changed his mind somewhat about colonialism, but came to regard it rather positively. This is me quoting from an article I read, kind of looking at the debate that, you know, Gilly's entire academic work on colonialism has sparked. Now, this paper fell under the radar somewhat because 2017 would become the year of his big article called The Case Against Colonialism. And as soon as it was published, academics called for the paper to be rejected from their publication, with some going as far as to call for the revocation of Gilly's own PhD. The paper was denounced in an apology issued by the publishing authority, and in response, Gilly withdrew from the American Political Science Association, citing anti-conservative bias. Bullshit. Oh, I'm sorry. sorry. I wasn't clear. Bullshit. I'm sorry. Bullshit. Now, I'm not going to cover the entirety of the case against colonialism because I would much rather dedicate my intellectual energy to my own thesis rather than countering the ignorance and barely concealed white supremacy of another scholar. And also other people have done this like far better than I have, and I've referenced them in my citations. Please check out their work. So today we're only just going to cover 2 bits. And then the next time I have demons to exercise or need a distraction from my own research, we will come back and cover the rest of these parts. So first things first, we're going to cover the introduction. And then after the introduction, we are going to cover a section called the 3 critiques of anti-colonialism. So first things first, I'm the realist, but no. First things first, the introduction. In the introduction, Gilly calls for the reconceptualization and positive reimagining of colonialism. He says that, and I quote, the case for Western colonialism is about rethinking the past as well as improving the future. It involves reaffirming the primacy of human lives, universal values, and shared responsibilities, the civilizing mission, without scare quotes, that led to the improvements in living conditions for most third world peoples during most episodes of Western colonialism. Except, what the fuck does this mean? As Martin A. Klein says, and I quote, European armies often marched uninvited into someone else's territories and then waited for the African force to attack. Where they could choose the battlefield, they assumed a defensive position, and when the African forces attacked, hundreds would be killed. Was this the value they showed for human life? End quote. And to add on to Klein's very excellent question there, was this devalued for shared responsibility self-evident when they let millions starve across their colonies in Ireland, India, and Kenya? Was the care for human life present and self-evident when the colonizers cut the hands of African laborers, whipped them and their children, and denied them basic sustenance when they failed to meet harvest quotas in the Congo? Was the primacy of shared responsibility present when the colonizers only built infrastructure that enabled the export of extracted goods and wealth and not connected villages together and to each other? Where was that concern for human life when these railroads, ports, and roads were constructed at massive human cost? So Gilly, sweetheart, Gilly, come. What the fuck do you mean when you say colonialism involved reaffirming the primacy of human lives, universal values, and shared responsibilities? When was colonialism ever about these things except in the delusions of our colonizers and in their propaganda? Put simply, Gilly wants to rebrand colonialism, drawing from the branding guidelines of his 19th century scholarly ancestors. The problem with this is that colonialism was never, ever about the civilizing mission. It was not about reaffirming the primacy of human lives. It was about wealth extraction, plain and simple. It was about taking everything they could as fast as they could with little care for the people they left behind. Also, Gilly forgets to question why it is that European methods and practices were the height of civility, and if Europeans were truly civilized. In fact, Gilly takes for granted the meaning of civility and takes it for granted that we would understand what he means and just agree with him. In fact, it is because Gilly takes all this for granted that he goes on to make the case for colonialism on 3 grounds. One, and I quote, is for governments and peoples in developing countries to replicate as far as possible the colonial governance of their past. And this is just a stupid statement because it suggests that our current independent nations are not just mere reproductions of the colonial state. like this man is writing from such a wide perspective. Like he's never set foot in Africa to realize, oh, by the way, the colonizers never left. The hue just changed. Come on, Gilly. You have a PhD in political science and you did not know how to do this basic research that I, a person without a PhD, was able to do. Gilly, baby, sweetheart, Bambi. So he then goes on to cite like Singapore, Belize, and Botswana as examples without acknowledging why he chose those countries and why other nations failed where they, apparently, and according to Gilly, succeeded. Yet even Gilly approaches these countries with like a level of political naivete that is quite frankly baffling considering the fact, and yet again, I need to remind you, this mandem has a PhD in political science. He should have been able to truly investigate and interrogate the statements of these nations in order to discover whether or not, number one, they replicated the colonial systems of governance, and number two, if that was a good thing. If Gilly wants us to replicate as far as possible the colonial governance of the past, what exactly is he asking for? Is he asking for the same system that divided Hutus and Tutsis and laid the groundwork for a genocide? Or is he referring to the same governance system that exacerbated the differences between Hindus and Muslims that laid the groundwork for the ongoing conflict between India and Pakistan, or what's happening in the Arab world with the Sykes-Picot agreement, right? Like, it seems to me that Gilly has kind of gone into this argument with this rose-colored idea of what colonialism is, just that like it brought democracy without ever acknowledging that colonial rule was highly and only authoritarian, and any democratic bent or hint that it had was merely performative. Because, and need I remind you, that the first African representative on the Legislative Council in Kenya was a white guy. To represent African matters, he was a white guy. The first, an actual black Kenyan didn't make it onto the council until 1944. So, what are you asking for, Gilly? I'm just confused. And once more, more to the point, how is the governance system that he's asking for any different from what currently exists? As I said in the very beginning of this, most post-colonial states have replicated these structures because it enables elite wealth and resource extraction. What we have is not our invention, but the invention and the legacy of the colonizers, Gilly. Come on, Buddha. Speaking of Kenya, because it is a country I am most familiar with, nothing has changed. As Ndenda argues, and I quote, in Kenya, the post-colonial state was essentially a reproduction of the colonial state at the level of ideological orientation, laws, and the basic economic structures. It failed to include minorities and the marginalized in the redistribution of wealth, and only invested in areas which were already economically productive or those which corresponded to the ethnicities of those in power. Indeed, this first leg for what, or rather how we should recolonize the countries with bad governance kind of operates under a fundamental misunderstanding that things have changed, which takes us to the second point in his thesis, which is just straight up recolonization. He, quoting from Gilly, and I quote, Western countries should be encouraged to hold power in specific governance areas, public finances, say, or criminal justice, in order to jumpstart enduring reforms in weak states. Once again, here Gilly presumes that Western countries have their shit together when, if you take a look at the UK and the US, I can tell you right now for free, the answer is a resounding, unequivocal with my chest, nope. Furthermore, it is the height of hubris to assume that you can come into a situation you know nothing about and solve the problem without unleashing any unintended consequences. Or need I remind you of the Cobra story? Now, if you were Gilly, you would rightly point out that this is an ahistorical story. It's just a cute little anecdote. And I would say, wow, Gilly, you've demonstrated more critical thinking skills in making that point than you had in the entirety of your article. Brava, well done. I knew you could do it. Here's a gold star. Then I would also point out the following real-world examples, like, for example, when Wells Fargo wanted their associates to open more bank accounts, they instituted quotas and bonuses for managers. We all know what happened there. So the point I'm trying to make here, back to the whole point that, like, Western countries should be encouraged to hold specific elements of power in, like, post-colonial states, is that who the fuck do you think you are to come in to solve a problem when you don't know why that problem exists? Like, it is such white savior energy that I literally just can't. Which then takes me to, like, the third and final case that Gilly makes for the reclamation of colonialism. And he says, and I quote, "Thirdly, in some instances, it may be possible to build new Western colonies from scratch." Again, presuming that such colonies don't exist, as in Palestine, Guam, Puerto Rico, or American Samoa, and assuming that if you were to create new ones, the same mistakes would not be repeated when we all know they would be. Like, the whole point of basically creating a colony is to create a hellhole for you to extract resources out of to enrich yourself. Like, it does not exist because you believe that you are the best thing in the world and you want to share it. No, that is secondary to your primary aim of making money. So these 3 points: the replication of colonial systems of governance, the entrusting of sovereign powers of failed states to Western powers, and third, the recolonization of certain nations, animated the case for Gilly's attempts to, trying to rebrand colonialism. And he begins his case by critiquing anti-colonialism as an intellectual tradition in the section titled 3 Failures of Anti-Colonial Critique. Here, he summarizes the critiques against colonialism along 2 veins of thought. That first, it was objectively harmful rather than beneficial, and that it was subjectively illegitimate rather than legitimate, end quote. And now we shall talk about it in equal turn. So the first thing that Gilly posits is, like, one of the problems with anti-colonial critique is that it fundamentally misunderstands the cost-benefit analysis that we tend to make. He says, and I quote, "The objective cost-benefit approach identifies a certain need of human flourishing, development, security, governance, rights, etc., and asks whether colonialism improved or worsened the objective provision of that need." Now, according to Gilly's estimation of this cost-benefit analysis, number one, it's very difficult to do a cost-benefit analysis with colonialism because colonialism has so fundamentally impacted every single area of the world that there is no nation you can say has not been impacted by colonialism. Even Ethiopia, which managed to resist the first wave of colonialism, got in the second wave when the Italians came through, and were still impacted fundamentally by what the Italians did when they were in the brief stint that they were Ethiopia's colonizers. Even Liberia was colonized by Black Americans who brought to the country white supremacy and white colonial ideals. So to try to do, like, a cost-benefit analysis is incredibly difficult because you have no control. You have no country which has not been impacted by colonialism to compare. And counterfactuals do not help because pre-colonial societies, like, yes, they existed, but our histories were written by our colonizers for the most part, and then consistently misremembered by those same colonizers. So it's incredibly difficult for anyone to come there and sit and say that, like, everything's going to be fine. Furthermore, Gilly limits his analysis and interpretation to, like, the late stages of colonialism. As we realized in the introduction, like, one of the first sentences he writes is, and I quote, "The notion that colonialism is always and everywhere a bad thing needs to be rethought in light of the grave human toll of a century of anti-colonial regimes and policies." That sentiment sets out the timeline for his analysis. And quite frankly, that is a bit unfair and a bit, historically disingenuous. Because colonialism in its early stages, the 15th to 18th centuries, is where we saw entire cultures, peoples, and ways of life wiped out because the colonizers were trying on new tactics and were trying to figure out how best to do this. And in that trial and error, they fucked up a lot, which is not to say they didn't fuck up in the 19th and 20th centuries. They continued to do so. But at least then there was, like, a precision to how they were doing things. They'd already figured out how it works, and now they're willing to continue doing it over and over and over again. Because if Gilly had extended his analysis to include the entirety of the colonial era, so from, like, 1492 to present day, he would have been forced to argue that the mass suicide of 50,000 Indians in the wake of their contact with Christopher Columbus was actually a good thing using his cost-benefit analysis, or that he would have had to reckon with that just horrific tragedy and figure out where it fits in for his case for colonialism. And even within the limited time frame he sets for his study, he also fails to consider the story of the Congo and how the quotas that were established to ensure the efficient industrial exploitation of Congo's minerals led to hands becoming a currency among colonial soldiers. This is the objective, inexcusable harm he seeks to wave away. This is the harm that, Gilly argues, pales in comparison to the good values like democracy, human rights, and freedom that colonialism imported. This is the colonialism that Gilly seeks to rebrand for the new era, less than 50 years after the last colonial possessions achieved independence. But oh no. No. His denial of history continues along similar veins, because with his motherfucking chest, he has the caucasity to claim that one of the reasons colonialism is a net benefit is because it led to the abolition of slave trading. And woo, this is where I laughed, because it's a case of like a person you hate making a decent point, but for the wrong reason. So let me just explain to you why he is so wrong. So yes, the Western colonial powers did get rid of the slave trade. I guess you deserve a huge pat on the back for that, followed by a punch in the face for all those same powers did in exacerbating the trade in African flesh. Which then takes us to the context of the abolition of the slave trade. First, are we just going to pretend that the slave trade was not something the Western colonial powers exacerbated? That is a problem that they agitated. It would be like praising an arsonist for stopping a fire that they created. As Sahar Khan argues in his critique of Gilly's work, and I quote, "The Portuguese began slavery in the 1500s as they explored West Africa, while the British brought the first installment of African slaves to Virginia in 1619. Colonizers therefore created the slave trade, chattel slavery in particular. Systematic decolonization and subsequent wars of independence eventually ended that slave trade," end quote. Indeed, and perhaps in another act of dishonesty, Gilly limits his consideration of slavery and colonialism to the later stages of colonialism in the scramble for Africa. He completely ignores the genocide of the Americas and the role slavery played in establishing and subsequently sustaining those early colonies. Next, are we also going to pretend that abolishing the slave trade is the same thing as ending slavery, or the same thing as the colonizers not continuing to use slavery as a mode of production time and time again through systems that were basically slavery with extra steps? When the Americans took over Haiti to restore good governance in 1915, as Gilly suggests ought to happen nearly a century later, they instituted a system of forced labor that was basically slavery with extra steps. In Kenya, the reason why the Giriama rebelled against the British, as we discussed in our Mekatilili wa Menza one-shot, was because they had instituted a system of forced labor that came into play when you could not afford paying taxes through money or in kind. Third, are we also going to pretend that the reasons why the British and their like ended slavery and the slave trade was not to ensure their control over the continent? Because in Zanzibar, where slave ports ran by the Sultanate thrived, the British ended the slave trade as a way to kill the economy of the local area, supplanted with their own idea of trade. In so doing, they made the Sultanate dependent upon them and their military might. Motivations fucking matter. For example, Gilly, if I offered to clear all your debt as a way of guaranteeing your freedom, that's a good thing, right? But what if it turned out that I only did that as a means of securing my control over you and your life? If it turned out that I only did that to ensure that you would be indebted to now me? Am I more benevolent? Who knows? But are you free? Are you experiencing the freedom of being debt-free, really? Or do you just have a new master? But still, Gilly continues to double down on his assessment of colonialism by citing an academic article which he claims supports his idea that the objective harms do not compare to the objective benefits that colonialism was responsible for. He cites this particular article titled "The Comparative Politics of Colonialism and Its Legacies and Introduction" by Alexander Dewan and Jan Heinrich Pierskala. About Juan and Pierskala's article, he says that, and I quote, found evidence for significant social, economic, and political gains under colonialism, expanded education, improved public health, the abolition of slavery, widened employment opportunities, improved administration, the creation of basic infrastructure, female rights, enfranchisement of untouchable or historically excluded communities, fair taxation, which is a lie, access to capital, which is also a lie, the generation of historical and cultural knowledge, okay, and the national identity formation, just to mention our few dimensions. He says that because the article cites all these things as like having been a byproduct of colonialism, it therefore suggests that the benefits outweigh the harms. And let me just, there's a lot to do to unpack in that sentence, specifically because Yuan and Perskella's article is just a literature review showing 4 potential areas of post-colonial scholarships and potential areas for that scholarship to expand into. It does not argue that colonialism was good, but instead says, here's what else we can be looking for and looking at. Yet Gilly goes out of his way to paint it as defending colonialism. And you'd have to wonder why. Perhaps because there is no way for you to weigh human suffering against the benefits of human freedoms he claims colonialism brought about. Especially if those freedoms were the byproduct of suffering. We learned what freedom is because colonizers tortured, denigrated, oppressed, and exploited us. We learned the hard way that freedom was something that we had lost and could never really recover in this world that you had created for us, because you murdered our old world, because you remolded us, because you played God. But as Gilly argues, all of this happened because we consented to it. And this is the point he brings about the illegitimacy. According to Gilly, and I quote, "Until very late, European colonialism appears to have been highly legitimate, and for good reasons. Millions of people moved closer to areas of intensive colonial rule, sent their children to colonial schools and hospitals, went beyond the call of duty in positions in colonial governments, reported crimes to colonial police, migrated from non-colonized to colonized areas, fought for colonial armies, and participated in colonial political processes, all relatively voluntary acts." And that word there, that relatively, does a lot of heavy lifting. It's almost the gravitational pull around which this entire argument rotates, because it suggests that under a different interpretation, some, if not all, of these acts were not entirely voluntary and were in fact coerced. The truth is that colonialism would not have gained ground without indigenous people. We showed the colonizers how to survive in our land. We staffed their armies and their administrations. And it is difficult to say if we helped knowing what would happen next, knowing that they would take everything that we had. But I can say that after colonialism became entrenched, it is a big mistake to presume that participation within a colonial system is tantamount to consent to be ruled within that system. Because, and by the same logic, people living in totalitarian regimes must consent to those regimes because they keep interacting and interfacing with them all the time. By the same logic, the Palestinians must approve of Israeli occupation, just as the Black South Africans approved of their oppression while under white apartheid. And that is just fucking idiocracy. The truth is that many of us, Africans in particular, didn't have a choice but to participate within this system. It's like how many of us kind of recognize the ills of capitalism, but we don't have a choice to live outside of it because capitalism is the ocean in which we swim. The only thing we can do is try to mitigate the harm of our potential actions and try to make sure that when we do have instances of exercising political power, we do so consciously, critically, and intentionally. Right? Because, and to go back to colonialism, if we wanted to advance and ensure our family's survival and the survival of our community, we don't have a choice but to participate within this system, because the costs of trying to live outside this system when it's just you and it's just your family are just too damn high and demand too much from each of us. If you were truly allowed to choose, and know that we will not be punished for choosing to live outside the system, if we were allowed to make complex, nuanced choices rather than the simple binary Gilly presents us of you're in all the way or you're out, then things would be different. When people went to cops to report crimes, it was because our traditional systems of governance, law enforcement, and social accountability had been destroyed by colonialism. We didn't have a choice but to turn to the new HBIC head bitch in charge if we wanted some semblance of justice or in the very least retribution. When people go beyond the call of duty in positions of governance, they did this, while this can be interpreted as a sign of effusive loyalty, it can also be interpreted as an act of survival. You do well so you can get the colonizers off your back. You do well so that you gain the tools to defeat them. You do well so that your family has food to eat and your children have opportunities that surpass you. You do well not because you agree, but because you want to survive. Even when the chiefs, who I decry as a colonial imposition, chose to be a part of this system because it enriched them, not because they wholly agreed with colonialism's overall vibe. But Gilly's ignorance and willful blindness gets even worse. After arguing that people must have consented to colonialism because they went to hospitals, took their children to missionary schools, and engaged with colonial forces, he then says, and I quote, "Indeed, the rapid spread and persistence of Western colonialism with very little force relative to the populations and geographies concerned is prima facie evidence of its acceptance by subject populations compared to the feasible alternatives." That's like saying the spread of capitalism in the post-World War II era around the world happened because it was a good idea that people acknowledged was good, and not because it was backed by American propaganda, military dominance, and economic might. Not because the many of the newly independent nations were colonies of capitalist nations who wanted to continue trade with their former colonizers and recognized that they could not do so if they called themselves communist. I think this is another reason why his article truly just pisses me off, because he never stops to ask why. Why is it that this article, why are things the way that they are? He just takes a lot of things for granted, and it's annoying. My English has gone. I'm just annoyed and I'm tired. I kind of just want to be done recording this episode because I don't want to see his work. I don't want to engage with his work for another couple of months. And yet Gilly persists. Once again, misappropriating history, he cites Patrice Lumumba's words as proof that the colonized accept and even embraced their colonizers. Quoting now from Gilly, and I quote, "Patrice Lumumba, who became an anti-colonial agitator only very late, praised Belgian colonial rule in his autobiography of 1962 for restoring our human dignity and turning us into free, happy, vigorous, and civilized men." Now, this is fucking gross for 3 reasons. First, the Belgians killed 50% of the native Congolese population and enslaved the native Congolese to ensure control over the extraction of their resources. This context is necessary because, second, Lumumba does say these words, but Gilly has removed them from the context in which Lumumba wrote. Lumumba thanks Belgian rule only to say, and I quote, "Does this mean I excuse the Belgians and blindly take up their defense? No, I only excuse what is excusable and defend what is defendable." And his defense of Belgian rule in one area is not defense of Belgian rule, period. Are you really so desperate, Gilly, to defend colonialism that you will twist the words of a man who was sacrificed at the altar of Belgian greed and colonial intent? Gleefully, I might add, a man whose truth was held hostage by the Belgians and only returned when the world, or should I say white people, began to have their regularly scheduled bicentennial conversation about systematic racism and colonialism in 2020. Which meant that when Gilly twisted these words in 2017, Belgium still held on to Lumumba's tooth, and yet Gilly used his words to defend Belgian colonialism. What the fuck? Seriously? Still, Gilly remains undeterred. In his 2022 Doubling Down, The Case for Colonialism in Response to My Critiques, he does not contextualize Lumumba's words within his 1962 autobiography. Instead, he chooses to misappropriate them further, that Lumumba's ability to engage with colonialism's complexities and nuances is tantamount to an acquiescence to colonial rule. Come on now. You are sure much smarter than that. Did you honestly not think we'd get the book and read it for ourselves, fam? So, where does this take us? Towards the third failure of anti-colonial critique. According to Gilly, not only do we have it wrong in that colonialism was objectively good and subjectively legitimate, but that now colonialism has been scapegoated by everyone for Africa's ills. Gilly says, and I quote, "The anti-colonial critique essentially weaponizes the colonial past." And this is a very interesting point. Begrudgingly, one that I agree with, but not because I think colonialism was a good thing, but because I know our leaders wield the colonial era like a political weapon. They are more willing to scapegoat their failures and inadequacies on colonial rule and trauma without acknowledging the role they played in failing to redress these harms. It is absolutely fucking laughable that generations of Kenyan presidents have decried the lack of political participation under colonial rule as a cardinal crime of the British, without acknowledging the roles they themselves have played in suppressing popular dissent, concentrating power in the executive, and limiting avenues for public participation. So yes, our colonizers stacked the deck against us and continue to do so today. Yes, colonialism fundamentally changed Africa in a way I'm not sure we can come back from. But in deploying it as a shield from criticism, our agency and our capacity as independent people is taken away. Part of being independent is making mistakes and holding yourself accountable for those consequences. Part of being independent is actually wanting to make a change. And this is one of the first lessons of adulthood that we all learn, right? When you visit a therapist and you uncover all these childhood wounds, the discovery is not an excuse to stay the same or resist change. It should be a motivator for something radical. But if we continue to blame all our faults at our colonizers, what are we saying? Are we saying that we fundamentally lack the capacity to change or heal? Because I'm also not dumb enough to say that our choices are not limited by the regimes that our colonizers continue to place us under. I'm very well aware that neocolonialism is a thing, but I'm just getting a bit sick and tired of our leaders just refusing to take responsibility for their own faults and for their own shortcomings, and refusing to just accept that, hey, I'm doing this because it benefits me and I fucked up, which then takes me to the end of this section of his work. And although I have, sweet baby Jesus, 10 pages to go in my estimation, Gilly should not be taken seriously. Not because this article is a questionable piece of scholarly literature, but because Gilly has done the very thing he accuses his critics of doing, of attempting to distill colonialism to simplicity when you cannot. You must not. Colonialism was complex and not without cost to everyone involved. While I am glad that I have modern plumbing, sanitation, and healthcare, and I am so glad that I was spared FGM, I find it morally repugnant to argue that the only way these developments could have happened was through colonialism, and that because things like plumbing, healthcare, technology are incredible, colonialism was worth it. Because implicit in Gilly's argument is that all the suffering inflicted by colonialism was worth it. All those deaths, the hatred, the suffering was worth those little pockets of good it enabled. That because we consent to colonialism, the evils that occurred under its watchful eye were also things that we consented to. There is something so fucking gross, so fucking tone deaf in that moral equation that it makes me question Gilly as a person. Yes, I get that you lived through the handover of Hong Kong. Yes, I get that your brain was probably fundamentally altered by constantly imbibing anxiety and fear and uncertainty. I get it. But for you to sit there and from your ivory tower and make the argument that colonialism, the people, especially the colonized, were better off when you yourself have never been colonized, and occupy the archetype of a colonizer is just fucking gross. It makes me question you as a person. I mean, who do you have to be to engage in a rebranding mission of colonialism? What groundwork are you intentionally or otherwise laying? What future are you trying to bring into fruition? And is it a future you yourself would want to live in if you were a subject of a future colony? Thank you all for listening. I may be back with another bit. Could do like another historical thing. I don't know. All I know is that right now I'm exhausted and I want to take a nap, but I can't because I have to do research. Adulthood. Anyway, bye-bye. Thank you so much for listening. I hope this all made sense. And see y'all in December. Hi, editing me here. And so I'm back from outer space. I just walked in to find you here with that sad look upon your face. No, I'm kidding. But I am back by popular demand. Again, I'm sorry. But I'm back because I thought it best to, after kind of looking at Gilly's work and reflecting on my own impassioned response, to kind of tell you guys the conclusions that I've come to, because I don't think I hit the nail on the head about why I was so angry. And it wasn't just that this man was trying to defend the indefensible and excuse the inexcusable. It wasn't just that. It was that I think the more I've engaged with this work, and who I think he is as an academic and as a person, the more I've come to realize that he, at least to me, he's the kind of person that doesn't want to realize, or doesn't like to think of himself as doing a bad thing, as advocating and believing in a bad thing. I think he understands the horrors of colonialism, which is why he works so hard to legitimize and wave them away. But I also know that he also, because of those horrors, because they are inexcusable, because there is no guarantee of the good that colonialism brings, at least not in the ways that he has framed it. There is the only guarantee that colonialism provides for the colonized is not healthcare, is not plumbing, is not education. It is subjugation, it is oppression, it is exploitation. And I think it terrifies me that people not only exist in the world that want this to come back or defending it with their chests, but that want to believe that what they're doing is a good thing, whether or not they believe that they are colonizing in defense of their own sovereignty, looking at you, Israel, or they are colonizing and genociding in an attempt to build a strong nation state, looking at you, China and Myanmar and Ethiopia, or they are colonizing or perpetuating your colonial relations because they need valuable mineral resources, not only to make themselves rich, but also to go in technologies that we all use every single day, like my phone and my laptop and my buds. Looking at you, Congo, France, basically every single Western country in the world. So you have all these players, all these agents who genuinely want to believe that whatever they're doing for the greater good. And then you have Gilly entering the chat and saying that this greater good also includes these values that we champion and that are wonderful and fantastic, and that because these values are so important, that they must be imposed by any means necessary. And it's the fact that you have somebody not being naked with their desires, somebody not being honest with themselves about the kind of harm they want to inflict, almost as if they know what they want is bad. And I just because I think had Gilly taken the time to reflect on his experiences in Hong Kong, especially his positionality as a white, Western educated man in British controlled Hong Kong, just as it's about to be handed back over to China, had he taken the time to look into the history and then written a context-specific article defending colonialism within the context of Hong Kong, I think that would have still sucked, but it would have been more understandable than what he's trying to do right now. So yeah, I think Gilly, I wish you nothing. I really thought that was going to go somewhere, but no, I actually wish him nothing. I wish you nothing. I don't even wish you ill. I don't even wish you the best. I just wish you nothing. Yeah, and I hope that one day you will come to realize that the kind of things that you are arguing for and the kind of arguments you are trying to make have real consequences that may not affect people like you, people that look like you, but will affect people like me and people who look like me. And despite the fact that I will say this with my chest, I am grateful for the fact that I have education and I have access to technology and healthcare and plumbing, and that I was spared the horrors of female genital mutilation. I am also keenly aware that everything that I am and everything that I could be is a response to and a byproduct of colonialism. Colonialism has robbed me of the ability to define myself on my terms. And now that's something that I have to fight for. And that I cannot describe to you the impact of that loss when you realize, or the impact of the realization that everything in your being and everything that you have and all the futures that you might want to pursue have been narrowed and fundamentally altered by a bunch of white people 100 years ago who believed they were better than you. That sense of theft, the theft of possibility, of future, of imagination is so deep that I don't yet have the words to quantify or describe the amount of pain it brings me. And I also refuse to believe that the benefits, quote unquote, benefits of colonialism could have only been shared through colonialism, right? Through the act of colonization. I think that was the only way the West was willing to do it, but I do not think that is the only way it could be done. And unfortunately, the argument that Gilly makes is that the only way you can spread values like democracy and human rights and dignity and what he calls the primacy of human life is through colonialism, which is fucking ironic considering colonial history, but also just such a weird argument to make that you kind of have to wonder if he's okay. And you have to be suspicious of his intentions and of the kind of world he is trying to realize. Yeah, I hope that this stream of consciousness reflection makes sense, because I'm doing this in 3 takes, and I really don't want to come back to this, at least not till December, when I'm all merry and bright. I am sorry for talking really quickly. Usually when I have a script and I'm really impassioned about it, I can talk at a mile a minute, but when I have to take the time to think through my words, I kind of end up speaking at a speed that most people talk at. I'm just a fast talker. I think you can blame it on what I suspect might be ADHD, but I haven't been diagnosed, so it's just me, a random person on the internet's opinion of my own mental health. But yeah, you might want to, this is coming a bit late, but good luck with trying to listen to me. I hope it all made sense, and thank you so much once again for bearing with. All right, bye. Make good choices where you can, and don't forget to be kind to yourself. I know you deserve it. Okay, bye. Thank you so much for listening to the Utajua Hujui podcast. I really appreciate you giving me your time of day. I know that your time is Very valuable. If you'd like to connect with me, you can find me on Instagram at utajuahujui.pod. That is at utajuahujui.pod on Instagram. Please don't forget to like, share, review, do all the nice things. I could really use the boost. Okay, enjoy the rest of your time on this planet. Goodbye.